Good day to our dear panelists and advisor. We are Group Z3128 in our research study is entitled The Association of Motivation and the Self-Development of Student Athletes in University of Mindanao Tagum College. Before anything else, we would like to introduce ourselves. By the way, I am Hari G. Loren, a BPE student.
Joel Timoring, a BPE student.
Julie Marie H. Tado, a BPE student. Next slide, please. So today I will going to tackle about the introduction. We all know that self-development is certainly incorporated into naive notions of being motivated as well as psychological approaches to well-being. Indeed, the feeling that one is developing is associated with motivation. However, the extent to which this phenomenological experience of having been developed reflects a real developmental change, which remains a question open to empirical inquiry. When personality psychologists discuss self-development, they are often talking about either changes in traits over time or changes in the wisdom or complexity that are presumably unavailable to straightforward self-report. So in the educational system is due to low self-confidence that lead a number of students having lack of enough participation and unsatisfactory progress after much time spent in the class. It is very necessary for a student to take risks and engage in the learning activities, and those who have, if they are assured of their abilities and are setting goals for themselves and work hard to achieve their goals without worrying about the outcomes. So assert that human is born with self-development, but it is changeable as they age. So in this study, so in Davao del Norte, it defines learning as a permanent change in the behavior of an individual. So they further define learning as the act of engaging students in activities and letting them get knowledge through their sharing experiences or getting information from the teacher. So self-development is defined as the belief or trust that a student has in performing something successfully. So the overall aim of this study is assessing motivation as a predictor of student athletes' self-development. So technically, this work aims at achieving the following research objectives. The first one is to ascertain the level of motivation of students in terms of a motivation. The next one is intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. Next is to determine the level of self-development of students measured in terms of challenge, freedom, respect, warmth, control, and success. And the next is to determine if there is a significant relationship between the motivation and self-development students, and to ascertain what domains of motivation significantly influences the self-development of students in University of Mindanao Tagum College.
Next slide, please. For our statement of the problem. So this study will be conducted to determine the influence, the level of motivation, and on the self-development of the student athletes in the University of Mindanao Tagum College. So specifically, the study will be conducted to seek the following questions. So the first one is the study aimed to assess the association between the motivation and the student self-development. In particular, the study sought answers to the following questions. For our independent variable is what is the level of motivation in terms of a motivation, intrinsic motivation, and extrinsic motivation. So while our dependent variable is what is the level of the self-development of the students in terms of a challenge, freedom, respect, warmth, control, and success. So number three, is there a significant relationship between motivation and the student's self-development at University of Mindanao Tagum College?
Next slide, please. In hypothesis, the hypothesis that there is a significant relationship between the level of motivation and self-development, and there is or are domains of motivation which significantly influences the self-development among college students shall be tested at 0.05 level of significance. In research participants, the participants of this study were the whole population of student athletes at the University of Mindanao Tagum College, with a total of population of 142. Slavin's formula primarily determines the sample size, but we use all the population for our research. In choosing the respondents, this study will employ the snowball sampling technique. This is a recruitment technique in which research participants are asked to assist researchers in identifying other potential subjects. Next slide, please. In Table 1, Profile of Respondents in University of Mindanao Tagum College Student Athletes, we have the first year number of respondents are 12, in second year is 24, third year 61, fourth year 45, in total of 142 respondents.
Next slide, please. And now let's move on to materials and instrument design and procedure. So the study will employ the questionnaires adapted from different studies and will be modified to fit the context of the respondents of the study. So part one assesses the level of motivation of students, which was based from the study of Antoine 2015, which was entitled The Correlation Between Motivation and Student Achievement. So the study will employ a non-experimental design utilizing the descriptive correlation technique of research, which is designed to gather data, ideas, facts, and information related to the study. So the quantitative aspect was an appropriate schedule for gathering data designed for the target respondents to answer the questions of the questionnaire.
Next slide, please. In our data collection, the researcher will secure the permission to conduct the study. The researcher will consider the distribution of the research instrument. After the approval to conduct the study will be given to the researcher. The questionnaires will be distributed to the specified respondents of the study in University of Mindanao, Tagum City. The researcher will administer the survey questionnaires to the participants through Google Forms or online, which will be done simultaneously. In a statistical tool for the mean, it is the value that summarizes the whole set of numbers primarily used to determine the level of extrinsic motivation and self-determination of student athletes. And in person are primarily employed in determining the significant relationship between motivation and student athletes' self-development.
Okay, so let's moving on. For the next slide, yes. So we have the results and discussion. For the table 2, it is the summary of the level of motivation of the respondents. That it's appear the results of the respondents generated an overall mean of 4.37, which is very high, that show that manifested, observed, and among the student athletes at the University of Mindanao Tagum College. So those mentioned above of the mean as was calculated by adding the mean score of the indicators and the standing order motivation. So among the three indicators, it is evident that indicator number 3, intrinsic motivation, got the highest mean of 4.45 with a standard deviation of 0.45 with a descriptive equivalent of very high. While the indicator number 2, which is extrinsic motivation, has gained the second highest mean of 4.37 with a standard deviation of 0.48 with the descriptive equivalent of very high. On the other hand, the indicator number 1, which is a motivation, has obtained a mean of 4.30 with the standard deviation of 0.54 with the descriptive equivalent of very high. So it means that the level of motivation which obtained an overall mean of 4.37 with a standard deviation of 0.41 with the descriptive equivalent of very high also. So it indicates that the measures of motivation among the student athletes at the University of Mindanao Tagum College are always manifested. So therefore, the student athletes are more likely to become successful because they are motivated. It is driving force for them to forward and push their come through based on this study. So less motivated individuals are likely to fail in their chosen career field. So and the high manifestation of motivation is dramatically impacts the student's success. For the table 3, which is the self-development, it's showing the summary of the level of the self-development of the respondents. It appears the results of the respondents generated in overall mean of 4.43 with a standard deviation of 0.38 with a destructive equivalent of very high. So that show the manifested observed among the student athletes at the University of Mindanao Tagum College, those mentioned above of the mean that was calculated by the adding mean scores of the indicators and the standing orders. For the table 3, it presents the level of the self-development. The indicator are present primarily in the table, including the corresponding mean, the standard deviation, and destructive equivalent. So based on the results of our study, so which is the indicator number 6, the success, got the highest mean of the 4.62 with a standard deviation of 0.44 with the destructive equivalent of very high. So followed by the indicator number 5, the respect get the second highest mean of the 4.45 with a standard deviation of 0.49 with a destructive equivalent of very high also. So the indicator number 4, that the control got the third highest mean of 4.42 with the standard deviation of 0.46 with the destructive equivalent with very high. So followed by the indicators 2 and 3, which is the freedom and success, get the same mean of 4.40 with the standard deviation of the freedom 0.48. So while the challenge is 0.52 with a destructive equivalent, both are very high. Lastly, which is warm, the first indicator get the mean of 4.39 with a standard deviation of 0.50 with a destructive equivalent of very high also. So it means that the level of the self-development get an overall mean of 4.43 with a destructive equivalent of very high. It indicates that the student athletes at the University of Mindanao Tagum College, it always manifested motivation toward self-development. So they are most likely motivated based on the results of the having a self-developed sense of self. So the sport management of these institutions shows strong management of the institutions, shows strong support to their athletes and encourage athletes to do well in their chosen sports. So therefore, they are believing that the support of their sports increases the student athletes' motivation and will help them self-develop the impact, the amount of the accomplishments they have generated, delivered for our institution. For the next slide, please. So we have table number 4, which is the correlation between motivation and the self-development. So this table, it shows the significant relationship between the level of motivation and the self-development among the student athletes at the University of Mindanao Tagum College. So the correlation coefficient between the levels of multimedia instruction and the self-determination is 0.703. So the p-value of 0.000, which is less than the 0.05 level of significance. So therefore, the researchers rejected the null hypothesis and the alternative hypothesis was accepted. It means that the motivation significantly correlates when the student athletes and the self-development. Moreover, fostering a motivation in sports could positively affect the student athletes' self-development. So in this table, it emphasizes on the roles of coaches, peers, parents plays a unique role in the player's motivation. So the coaches are the most influential social agents in autonomy, whereas peers are the most influential in the competence and relatedness. So in addition, and a lack of motivation to interact with their coaches and peers noticeably affects their performance and deteriorates the self-development of athletes. By the social contact between the exercises and the spectators improve the relatedness of both groups of user, which means the support from the significant others contributes to the feeling of belongingness. So indeed, the motivation is crucial to the athlete's self-development.
Next slide, please. And now let's move on to the conclusion. So the level of motivation among student athletes at the University of Mindanao Tagum College was very high and indicated that measures of motivation are always manifested. So the level of self-development among student athletes at the University of Mindanao Tagum College indicates that when student athletes are motivated, there is a very high self-development. So there is a significant relationship between the level of motivation and self-development among student athletes at the University of Mindanao Tagum College.
Next slide, please. In our recommendation, the following conclusions are drawn based on the findings of this study. So first, the institution may provide insights into the effectiveness of motivation and student athletes' self-development. It will serve as the stepping stone to further emphasis motivation in sports. Number 2, we have the sports coaches could better understand the relevance of motivation to students' self-development. Thus, it could create better sports management to build a robust system. Third, it may serve as a guide for the sports office to implement interventions and programs which aim to foster motivation among all student athletes towards self-development. Number 4, as one of the beneficiaries, students have a chance to explore and know the importance of motivation to our self-development. And lastly, Future research can be conducted based on the result of this study.
For the next slide, please. And also for our references is presented of our screen. I think we are done. So for our dear panelists, so we are open for your comments, suggestion, and recommendation for our improving our manuscript. That's all. Thank you and God bless.